Imagine this, a street so neat it looks painted into existence. Lawns stretch like carpets of perfect green, fences gleam in identical white rows, and the air itself seems rehearsed into silence. It is the kind of neighborhood where every detail whispers the promise of order, of peace, of belonging. But perfection has a way of hiding cracks, and when those cracks spread, they show not just what lies beneath the paint, but what has always been waiting in the silence. Marcus stepped out of his car that morning, with boxes stacked in his arms, sweat clinging to his brow but a smile lingering all the same. This house was more than a building. It was proof of years of work, long hours, and the faith that ownership meant safety. For him, the fence around the yard stood as a marker of belonging, his line of protection, his claim on peace. What he didn't yet know was that for others, the same fence was a reminder. Someone they hadn't chosen now lived inside their order. And for one woman, it was a threat to the balance she believed she kept. Karen watched from her porch, arms crossed loosely, her lips curling with the hint of a smile that wasn't quite friendly. She leaned just enough on the railing to make it clear she had been waiting. Neighbors peeked from windows and porches, their eyes darting quickly away whenever Marcus glanced up. The silence was polite, but it was also heavy, as though the entire block had agreed to speak with their stillness. Karen broke that silence first. "Hope you know the rules here are strict." Marcus adjusted the box in his arms, pausing just long enough to catch her gaze. "Good," he replied. "Rules keep things fair." Her smile didn't shift. If anything, it deepened. But it was the kind of smile that left shadows instead of warmth. She turned her head slightly, surveying his fence, his driveway, his moving truck. "Fairness," she said, "depends on how well people fit in." The words hung there, wrapped in politeness, but sharpened underneath. Marcus carried the box inside, pretending not to notice the weight hidden in her tone. Yet even before the door closed behind him, he could feel it pressing on him, a warning disguised as welcome. The first days passed with a rhythm that almost felt normal. Marcus cut the grass, repainted the porch rail, waved at neighbors who waved back with hesitant hands. He carried himself with quiet pride, unaware that whispers followed when he passed. At night, the street grew silent, but not with peace. It was the silence of watching, of judgment measured in stillness. And then, one morning, the first envelope appeared in his mailbox. The paper was crisp, the wording coldly professional, a notice about grass length, a violation fee attached at the bottom. Marcus laughed at first, shaking his head. The grass was barely an inch over. He set the paper aside, treating it as a minor error. But the next morning, another envelope waited. And the next. Trash can visible. Fence paint, not up to community standard. Mailbox non-compliant. Each letter folded the same way, each signature stamped with the weight of authority. Paper began to pile on his kitchen counter like a slow flood of warning. Marcus carried one of the notices back to Karen, who happened to be waiting outside with a cup of coffee in hand. "This must be a mistake," he said, holding out the letter. Karen glanced at it, her smile unchanged. "Nothing personal, just the rules." "But the trash bin," she cut him off with a tilt of her head. "Rules don't bend for anyone. That's how we keep standards high." Her words landed with precision, as if she had practiced them. Neighbors on porches leaned forward just slightly, pretending to read newspapers or sip tea, but their silence was louder than any words. Marcus stood there, realizing it wasn't about trash cans or mailboxes. It was about belonging. Belonging that could be granted or revoked, depending on who held the paper. And here, Karen held all the paper. That evening, Marcus walked his yard, running his hand across the fence. For him, it was a shield, a symbol of the safety he had earned. But now it seemed thinner, fragile against the weight pressing in. Each plank looked less like protection and more like a reminder that he was being kept in check. The silence of the street grew heavier, each window a watching eye, each door a gate closed to him. Belonging, he realized, was conditional, and the conditions were written by someone else. Inside, the notices stacked higher. Paper became more than words. Paper became a threat. He felt it each time he opened his mailbox, the anticipation of another accusation, another reminder that rules here weren't for fairness, they were for control. What Karen had hinted at with a smile was now made clear in ink. The neighborhood had promised peace, but peace came with terms, and for Marcus, those terms were already being rewritten. The question lingered in the silence that night, echoing between fences and through closed doors. What happens when one voice refuses to bend to the rules written against it? The mailbox became his battlefield. Each morning Marcus walked down the short path from his porch with the faintest hope that the box would hold nothing but bills or advertisements. But each time, the thin metal door opened to another envelope bearing the HOA's letterhead. Paper, folded with precision, words, sharpened into cuts. The violations were small, almost absurd. Mailbox flag chipped, grass uneven at the corner, trash can visible from sidewalk. Fines stacked like shadows, $50. Here, $75 there, each signed with authority that pretended to be neutral. But neutrality doesn't repeat itself with this much consistency. Neutrality doesn't follow one man while others stand untouched. Marcus read them at his kitchen table, lips pressed into a hard line. He had cut the grass that morning, measured even. He had painted the mailbox the week before. He had placed the trash bin exactly where the guidelines had said. It wasn't about rules. It was about someone using rules as a weapon. He confronted Karen one morning, letter in hand. "This one says the fence is non-compliant," he said evenly. Karen sipped her coffee, eyes tracing the fence line with calculated indifference. "White paint chips faster in this climate," she replied. "Can't lower standards for one property. It was painted last month. Then perhaps you should try again." The neighbors on their porches kept still. A few sipped from cups, their eyes sliding away. Silence held the weight of agreement. Marcus folded the paper slowly, aware that he wasn't just fighting Karen's words, but the quiet support behind her. He tried ignoring the notices, stacking them neatly in a drawer. But the drawer filled. He tried appealing to the board formally, but the votes came back unanimous against him every time. At meetings, he stood before rows of neighbors, Karen seated confidently at the front. Marcus said, "You find me for weeds that don't exist." Karen leaned into her microphone, her voice smooth. "We hold all properties to the same high expectations. Perhaps the standards are higher than you're used to." Laughter rippled faintly through the room. Not loud enough to be called mockery, but sharp enough to cut. Marcus felt it in his chest, the heat rising not just from humiliation, but from knowing that the silence afterward was worse. Silence meant agreement. Silence meant Karen's paper was law. That night, Marcus walked the fence again. He ran his hands over the boards, the paint still smooth, the wood strong, but paper kept finding its way across it, breaking through without ever touching it. The fence, once his symbol of belonging, now seemed less like a shield and more like a target. Each paper in the drawer felt like a small cut, bloodless, but real, and cuts, when deepened, eventually bleed. The whispers began softly, drifting like smoke across porches when Marcus walked by. At first it was only the flicker of eyes above coffee mugs, voices lowering mid-sentence. But whispers carry, even when they try to hide. Doesn't keep up. Doesn't understand the rules. Always questioning. Each phrase cut sharper than the last, carving him into an outsider with every passing day. By the time HOA meetings arrived, the whispers had grown into something heavier. The boardroom smelled of old wood and disinfectant, the fluorescent lights humming just above. Rows of folding chairs faced the long table at the front, where Karen presided like a conductor before an orchestra of silence. Marcus sat straight. In his chair, his stack of letters tucked under his arm, the air around him thick with expectation. Karen called the meeting to order with a firm strike of her pen against the table. "Our first item," she announced, her eyes lingering on Marcus, "concerns repeated violations by one of our residents." Marcus stood, holding out the papers. "These are fabrications. My lawn has been cut, my mailbox painted. I've followed every written rule." Karen tilted her head, voice smooth as glass. "Then perhaps you misunderstand what compliance looks like." The room stirred with faint chuckles, shoulders shaking. The laughter wasn't loud enough to disrupt the meeting, but it was precise enough to humiliate. Marcus tightened his jaw, forcing his voice steady. "You can't fine me for rules you invent," Karen replied without missing a beat. "We don't invent. We maintain." The board members nodded in silence, pens scratching against paper as they recorded votes. Every decision, unanimous, every fine upheld. The neighbors seated behind Marcus said nothing, their silence serving as a kind of invisible applause for Karen. The votes weren't just about grass and fences. They were judgments, dressed as procedure. Marcus returned home late that night, the papers heavier than before. On his walk from the car, he felt eyes on him from every porch. Curtains twitched, doors creaked, but not a word was spoken. The silence wasn't absence. It was agreement, louder than voices, louder than laughter. He climbed his porch steps, and for the first time felt the boards groan under his weight, as if the house itself could sense the pressure. Inside, he spread the papers across the table, each letter a scar. He could almost hear the whispers in the silence of his kitchen, faint echoes of laughter following him home. The votes had been cast, but it wasn't the rules that decided. It was silence that had chosen his fate, again and again, and silence, he realized, was not neutral. It was the sharpest weapon of all. The storm arrived first in the sky, then in the words. Clouds gathered over the neighborhood, rolling dark against the white fences, thunder growling like a warning. Rain lashed across the lawns, striking the pavement in steady, punishing rhythms. Marcus stood at his window, watching the storm flood, the street gutters, and thought how fitting it was. Nature itself mirroring the tension swelling in his life. The next notice arrived soaked at the edges, water seeping through its folded crease. He peeled it open to find yet another violation, this time accusing him of improper siding maintenance. His siding was new, still gleaming under the rain, but the letter spoke as though decay had already consumed it. He held it in his hand until the ink blurred, the storm outside smearing into the storm in his chest. That evening, Karen appeared on her porch again, an umbrella tilted above her head. She raised her voice just enough to travel through the storm. "Keeping up is harder than it looks, isn't it?" Marcus leaned against his doorway, the notice clutched in his palm. "You mean keeping up with your imagination?" Her smirk held, steady. "Some people don't last long here. Standards aren't suggestions." The rain punctuated her words, hammering on the roofs, on the fences, on the silence between them. Neighbors peeked through curtains, their faces illuminated in the storm's flashes. None spoke, none interfered. The storm outside was violent, but the one within the neighborhood was colder. Inside, Marcus began collecting every notice, every envelope, every scrap of paper that accused him. He laid them out across his dining table like evidence, photographing each one, recording dates and times. His phone began to fill with folders, pictures of his lawn, his mailbox, his siding. He started filming short clips, walking along his fence as proof. Every recording was a small act of resistance, each one a shield against the storm. But the notices grew more aggressive. Karen had escalated, sending formal complaints to city officials. She wrote of chronic neglect, of devaluing property, standards, of threats to neighborhood order. Marcus read them late into the night, his hands tightening with every line. The paper war was no longer confined to envelopes. It now reached into the machinery of the city itself. One night, thunder shook the windows as Marcus sat alone at the table. The letters glared back at him, their bold fonts relentless. He looked at his fence through the rain-streaked glass, the paint shining under each flash of lightning. Strong, untouched, yet somehow accused. The storm raged inside and out, and Marcus knew storms never stay contained. It began with a phone, raised at the wrong moment. A neighbor, standing on their porch, recorded Karen in mid-lecture, her voice sharp as she pointed toward Marcus's driveway. Rain slicked the pavement, the air heavy with storm's residue, but her words cut through clearly. "If you can't keep to the standards, you don't belong here." The phone caught Marcus's calm reply, caught the silence of others watching, caught the weight of a neighborhood's complicity. Within hours, the clip made its way online. The internet devours moments like this. A video, under a minute long, uploaded without context, captioned with a hint of outrage, HOA Karen at it again. Shares multiplied, comments flooded in. Some mocked her arrogance, others condemned her tone. But in the flood of responses, Marcus noticed something chilling. Many voices stayed absent. Silence, again, louder than outrage. He watched the video on his phone, hearing his own voice replayed against Karen's. It felt strange to see his life turned into content, strangers dissecting it as though it were theater. For Marcus, it wasn't entertainment. It was the daily grind of paper, silence, and humiliation. But now, the world beyond his fence was watching. Karen's reaction was swift. At the next meeting, her words cut sharper than before. "Recording private disputes is a violation of community trust," she announced to murmurs of agreement. Marcus met her stare. "What about fabricating violations? Is that trust?" Her jaw tightened, but she didn't answer. Instead, the board shifted papers, cleared throats, filled the silence with procedural noise. The viral moment was not acknowledged officially, but it lingered. Neighbors glanced at Marcus differently now, some with pity, others with hostility. The clip had turned him from target into symbol. At night, Marcus scrolled through comment sections. Some voices praised his composure, others questioned why he stayed. Sell the house. Move somewhere better. Easy words from strangers, who didn't understand that leaving would mean surrendering not just property, but dignity. He thought of history, of families who faced rules designed to keep them out, of voices erased by silence. What was happening here was not new. It was an echo, reshaped but familiar. The silence in the neighborhood thickened. Conversations cut off when Marcus approached. Smiles stiffened. A few whispered, "Hang in there," when no one else could hear. But the moment Karen appeared, their mouths sealed. He realized then, silence was more contagious than speech. The video continued to circulate, its reach stretching beyond what Karen could control. But within the neighborhood, her grip only tightened. Silence became her shield, and she wielded it as fiercely as paper. Marcus closed his phone one evening, staring at his reflection in the darkened screen. His story was spreading, but his isolation was growing. The world was watching, but his street was still silent, and silence, left unbroken, becomes its own kind of judgment. The letters no longer arrived like warnings. They arrived like weapons. Each envelope slid into Marcus's mailbox with the same sharp edge of intent, folded neatly as though precision itself could disguise cruelty. The fines grew larger, the language colder. What once accused him of chipped paint now declared him a chronic violator. What once scolded his lawn now labeled him a threat to community standards. Paper had turned into fire, and the flames licked higher with each notice. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, the document spread wide like a battlefield map. Every word dripped with intent to crush. He knew what came next. The escalation was inevitable. And then it came. A formal notice of eviction proceedings. The HOA, under Karen's signature, declared Marcus unfit for residency. The date was set. The words were absolute. Marcus carried the paper to Karen's porch, his hand steady, but his chest burning. "This isn't about rules anymore," he said. Karen sipped her tea, the steam rising between them. "It's always about rules." "No," Marcus said, his voice cutting sharp. "It's about you deciding who belongs." She tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "And the board agrees. That's all that matters." The silence from nearby porches thickened. No one intervened. No one spoke. Their stillness was louder than her words, louder than his defiance. It was silence that gave her voice its echo, silence that turned her papers into flames. That night, Marcus sat under the dim kitchen light, papers stacked like ash before him. For every accusation he had evidence, photos, videos, timestamps, receipts. He gathered them, organizing each into files. He reached out to attorneys, his words clipped but determined. He would not leave silently. If Karen wanted a war of paper, he would match her with proof. The silence of neighbors weighed heavier than the fines. He could handle the financial cost, the procedural grind. What gnawed at him was the quiet, the way entire porches watched his fight without a single voice raised. Silence had become her weapon, her fuel. Each absence of resistance gave her more authority, more certainty. Marcus whispered to himself, as he stacked the last folder, his voice steady against the silence of the house. "They think I'm cornered. But fire doesn't just burn. It spreads." He looked once more at the fence outside, glowing faintly under the moonlight. It stood as strong as ever, though paper tried to say otherwise. To Karen, it was a symbol of intrusion. To him, it was a warning, a boundary that could no longer be ignored, and when paper becomes fire, there are only two choices: burn quietly, or let the flames expose the truth. The fence had always been a line, white wood against green lawn, a marker between his space and theirs. At first it was comfort, then it became a target. But now, Marcus saw it as something else entirely, a warning. The plank stood tall, stubborn against rain, wind, and accusation. No matter how many notices claimed it was chipped, uneven, or non-compliant, the boards held their place. Each nail in the wood felt like a nail in his resolve. One Saturday morning, Marcus stepped out with a bucket of paint. Neighbors watched from porches, eyes tracking every brushstroke. He painted slowly, carefully, each stroke gleaming bright under the sun. It wasn't repair, it was reclamation. The fence wasn't just his property anymore. It was his declaration. He belonged, and he wasn't leaving. Karen emerged from her porch, her tone sharp enough to pierce the quiet. "Wasting paint won't fix violations." Marcus didn't look up. "It's not for fixing, it's for reminding." She folded her arms, the smile cutting thin. "Reminding who?" He set the brush down, turned to meet her gaze. "Everyone." The silence thickened. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, the weight of his defiance pressing into the air. Karen lingered, then turned away, muttering something no one quite caught. But the unease she left behind clung to the street like fog. By evening, Marcus's fence gleamed brighter than before. Under the glow of porch lights and fading sun, it looked less like a boundary and more like a beacon. Children paused their bicycles to stare at it. Couples whispered as they walked by. The fence no longer divided. It warned. Something was coming. And then it arrived. A final envelope, heavier than the rest, sealed with formal lettering. Marcus tore it open at the dining table, the ink bold and absolute. The HOA was pursuing eviction through the courts. Karen's signature stretched across the bottom, triumphant, final. Marcus read it twice, then laid it beside his folders of evidence. His chest rose with steady breaths, not fear, but focus. He had known this day would come. He had been preparing for it all along. Outside, the night grew still. No rain, no thunder, only silence. But it wasn't the silence of complicity anymore. It was the silence before a storm, heavy, waiting to break. Marcus walked to the fence, running his hand along the boards. For months, it had been painted as weakness, turned into a target. Tonight, it felt like armor. The storm wasn't weather this time. It was judgment. And soon, it would break wide open. The courtroom was colder than the street outside. Polished wood reflected the harsh lights above, and the air smelled faintly of varnish and tension. Rows of benches creaked under the weight of neighbors, bored, members, and silent onlookers. They filled the room not with noise but with stares, each gaze sharpened into judgment. The doors closed behind Marcus with a heavy thud, sealing him into the silence that had followed him for months. Karen sat near the front, papers stacked neatly, her posture that of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. Her pen tapped against the table, steady as a metronome, her confidence radiating like armor. Every glance she cast toward Marcus carried the certainty of victory. The judge entered, robes flowing, gavel striking wood. The sound echoed, commanding order. Karen rose, smoothing her skirt, her voice cutting sharp as glass. "Your Honor, this resident has repeatedly violated the standards of our community. He has ignored fines, neglected property, and disrupted the harmony we work so hard to preserve." Marcus sat still, his hands folded, eyes steady. He listened as Karen spun her tale, trash bins left out, fences neglected, rules ignored. Each accusation delivered with rehearsed precision. The crowd shifted in their seats, nodding faintly, some lips curling into knowing smirks. The silence of their complicity wrapped the room, heavy as chains. Karen lifted another paper, her voice rising with certainty. "This pattern of defiance is not only unacceptable, it threatens the integrity of the entire neighborhood." "The fie," Judge turned to Marcus. "Do you wish to respond?" Marcus stood slowly, each movement deliberate. He carried no stack of papers, no armful of rules, only a single folder in his hand. He paused, letting the silence stretch before he spoke. "I've followed every written rule, every lawn cut, every fence painted, every bin placed exactly where the handbook said. The violations aren't about standards, they're about control." Karen scoffed lightly, shaking her head. "He has no evidence." Marcus opened the folder, laying down photographs, timestamps, videos. Each one matched to the dates of her claims. A lawn freshly cut on the day she declared it overgrown. A mailbox, painted and gleaming on the week she found it chipped. The crowd leaned forward, the silence shifting from agreement to unease. Karen's smile wavered, but her voice pressed forward. "Perhaps the photos were taken after notices were issued. Anyone can make themselves look compliant after the fact." Marcus looked directly at her. "Funny. Then why do the timestamps match the same hours your letters were written?" The room stirred. Karen's pen tapped harder, the rhythm uneven now. The judge leaned forward, examining the evidence with narrowed eyes. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like agreement. It felt like doubt. Karen forced another smile, but her voice cracked faintly. "One man's records can't outweigh the decision of an entire board." Marcus's reply was sharp, clipped. Truth doesn't need a majority vote. The silence that followed was different. No longer a wall against him. Now it was a pause, heavy with possibility, waiting to break. The judge's eyes moved from the photos to Karen's stack, then back again. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder now, a thin electrical thread stitching the room together. The benches creaked as people leaned forward, drawn by the possibility that the script might not go the way they expected. Karen reached for her pen, as if it were a gavel of her own. She flipped to a new page, posture rigid, voice sharpened to restore control. "These images don't negate the volume of complaints. Multiple residents have documented repeated neglect. Marcus didn't flinch. Multiple residents copied your language. Same phrases, same timestamps. A ripple moved through the benches. Papers rustled. Shoes shifted. The judge adjusted their glasses, gaze narrowing on the letters Karen had supplied. The phrases were too similar to be coincidence. Threat to community order, significant visual decline, compromises harmony. The words repeated like a choir trained to sing a single note. Karen lifted her chin, refusing the shift. Standards require consistency. Manipulation does too, Marcus replied. She pushed a packet forward, the edges aligned with brutal precision. City complaints were filed as well. Marcus nodded once, and answered. Every one of them closed without action. The judge looked to Karen. Is that accurate? She hesitated, then found a thread. Closures don't mean compliance. They mean backlog and leniency. Marcus laid down another sheet. Email confirmations, closure notices, dates. The judge read silently. A cough sounded from the back row. Someone else exhaled like they'd been holding their breath for months. The silence that had once been a wall now felt like a surface beginning to crack. Karen's pen tapped twice, then faster, a rhythm slipping off beat. She reached to sign a board affidavit summarizing the HOA's position. The plastic cracked at the clip. The pen slipped from her fingers and snapped at the seam, ink threading out in a thin blue line across the margin. The sound was small, but it carried. Heads turned. The once perfect posture faltered. She tried to brush it off, voice climbing higher to cover the stumble. This is immaterial. The issue is his refusal to conform. Marcus's voice stayed low. I conform to every rule on paper. You're enforcing the ones in your head. A few faces in the crowd shifted from doubt to recognition, like they were remembering something they'd pushed aside. The judge held up a letter from the HOA portal and compared it to Karen's typed notes. The fonts didn't match. The spacing didn't match. The dates were too convenient. Explain the discrepancies, the judge said. Karen spoke quickly, the words starting to bump into each other. Formatting differences. Transcription. Volunteers help with the notices. Minor variations. Are normal. Marcus took a breath and placed a printout of the HOA's digital log next to the letters. The metadata told a plainer story. Edits, rollbacks, reissues. Edits that aligned with meeting nights. Edits that aligned with votes. Karen swallowed, voice thinning. Our process is transparent. Then why does transparency look like correction fluid? Marcus said. Somebody choked on a laugh and then stifled it. The judge raised a hand, restoring order without speaking. Karen wiped the ink from her fingers with the edge of a tissue, leaving a pale blue smear across her knuckles. The image clung to the room, a mark that wouldn't quite disappear. She tried again, reaching for authority the way one reaches for a railing in the dark. Even if a few notices had clerical errors, the pattern remains. This resident resists our culture of compliance. Marcus tilted his head, a slight motion that felt like the turn of a key. Culture or control? Karen opened her mouth, but the answer didn't arrive. She reached for another page and it slid away from her hand, skittering to the floor with a noise that felt too loud. She bent to grab it, bumping the table. Another sheet drifted down like a surrendered flag. The board members stared straight ahead, faces empty of rescue. The benches behind them stayed quiet, not supportive quiet, not hateful quiet. New thing, sober and watching. The judge tapped the edge of the bench with a finger. I will consider the veracity of each submitted document. For now, I'm concerned with consistency and motive. Karen tried to reclaim the room with a smile. That didn't land. Our motive is harmony, Marcus answered before the echo faded. Harmony for who? The question hung, and for once no one rushed to fill the space. The silence that had once been weapon now felt like a witness. A man in the second row shifted, then looked down at his shoes. A woman near the aisle pressed her lips together, eyes flicking toward Karen and away again as if she'd just realized how much she'd been agreeing with by saying nothing at all. Karen forced her voice steady, assembling the remains of certainty. Whatever minor inconsistencies you think you've found, the board has voted repeatedly. Our decisions reflect the community's standards. Your decisions reflect your signature, Marcus said quietly. Let's talk about signatures. The judge leaned back, interest sharpened. The room leaned with them. Karen pulled another pen from her bag, the backup for moments like this, and its cap fought her, slipping, clicking twice before giving way. She placed it on the page like a sword being placed on a map. Marcus looked at the board members one by one. You signed these too? No one answered. One board member swallowed. Another rubbed at a temple as if a headache had arrived late. Karen started to speak for them, but the judge lifted a hand, not to silence Marcus, but to quiet her. Marcus rested his fingertips on the folder's final tab. His breathing was even, the calm of a runner who knows the finish line is not where the crowd thinks it is. He glanced at the benches, then back to the table, then to the judge. I have one more set of documents, he said. They go to the heart of motive. Karen's new pen hovered, point trembling just slightly over the paper. Marcus opened the final tab in his folder, the papers sliding free with deliberate weight. He laid them flat across the table, each one marked with crisp signatures and stamped seals. The room leaned forward as if pulled by a thread. These, Marcus said evenly, are property records. Karen's eyes flicked downward, then up again, her composure cracking for the first time. Those aren't relevant to this case. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. They're more relevant than anything else you've said. He spread the documents wide, revealing deed after deed. His own house, the one next door, another across the street, multiple addresses within the very HOA that had tried to push him out, each stamped with his name, each undeniable. Gasps rippled across the benches. The silence, once complicit, now broke into scattered murmurs. Karen's pen slipped from her hand again, clattering against the table. She scrambled to retrieve it, but the sound was already carved into the room, the symbol of her grip loosening. Karen's voice rose higher, brittle with panic. Ownership doesn't excuse violations. Marcus looked directly at her, his tone a scalpel. Ownership makes your eviction notice meaningless. You wanted me out, but I'm the one keeping you in. The room erupted in whispers. A man in the back let out a low whistle. Someone else muttered, "No way." The silence that had shielded Karen fractured completely, crumbling into disbelief. Karen's face flushed red as she pointed toward the papers. This is manipulation. He's twisting the narrative. Marcus shook his head slowly. No, you tried to twist the rules. I bought the ground they stand on. The judge leaned forward, studying the deeds. The legal weight of them was undeniable. The balance of power, once tilted against Marcus, now flipped in a single undeniable moment. The crowd shifted like a tide, shoulders angling away from Karen, eyes turning toward Marcus with something resembling respect, or at least recognition. Karen's voice cracked. This isn't how it works. Marcus's reply landed like a hammer. It's exactly how it works. You don't own me. I own the walls that surround you. The silence that followed wasn't complicity. It wasn't agreement with Karen. It was shock. It was realization. It was the sound of power reversing in real time. Karen reached for her papers, her fingers trembling, shuffling them out of order. Her perfect stack collapsed into scattered sheets across the table. Ink stains smeared across her hand from the broken pen earlier, dark against her pale skin. The image told the story better than words, authority unraveling, control slipping. The crowd leaned closer, whispers rising into a steady hum. The room had shifted. The woman who once wielded silence like a blade was now drowning in it. And Marcus, the man she tried to erase with paper, now held the weight of the neighborhood in his hands. The courtroom air felt different now, charged with the hum of voices that had once been sealed in silence. Neighbors shifted on the benches, leaning into one another, whispering words they had never dared to speak aloud. The tide was turning, and everyone in the room could feel it. Karen tried to gather her scattered papers, hands shaking, the edges slipping from her grip. She stacked them too quickly, and they slid sideways again, fluttering like leaves falling out of season. Her smile, once the polished weapon she carried everywhere, had thinned into a nervous twitch. A voice broke from the benches. Low, at first, but clear. She fined me for the same thing. Heads turned. A man in the third row stared down at the floor, his words hanging heavy in the air. Another voice followed, sharper, angrier. She told me to stop parking in my own driveway. Karen snapped her head toward them, her tone desperate. Out of order. None of this is relevant. But the voices wouldn't stop. She threatened to tow my car. She said I didn't cut my lawn right. She charged me twice for a repair she knew wasn't needed. The murmurs grew louder, rolling together. The silence that once held them, now shattered. It wasn't one man against her anymore. It was the room itself, the crowd that had propped her up with their silence, now shifting to expose her. Karen slammed her palm against the table, her voice shrill. Rules are rules. Without me, this place falls apart. Marcus's response was calm, steady, final. Without you, this place finally breathes. The judge raised a hand, but the crowd didn't need silencing anymore. They had found their voice, and it was no longer hers. Karen's authority, once absolute, had cracked in front of everyone. The woman who controlled through silence now found herself drowned by it, a silence she couldn't bend back to her will. Her pen rolled off the table, clattering to the floor. She reached for it, but her hand hovered midway, as if even she knew the sound had already told the story. Her power was gone. The judge's voice carried like a gavel, even before it struck. The court will review these records and deeds in full. Until then, all motions by the HOA are denied. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel hit. The room exhaled. Marcus didn't smile, didn't gloat. He gathered his folder calmly, tucking the papers back into order. The neighbors' murmurs still swirled, some with shame, some with relief, some with gratitude that someone else had spoken first. Karen sat frozen, her papers in disarray, the ink still smeared across her hand, her voice caught in her throat. For years, she had ruled through fear and silence. But silence, once broken, becomes a mirror. And now it reflected her downfall for all to see. The doors of the courtroom opened, light spilling across the floorboards. For the first time, Marcus stepped through not as a man defending his place, but as a man who had reclaimed it. And behind him, the silence that had once been a prison had become something else entirely. A verdict. When the courtroom emptied, the neighborhood felt different. The same white fences lined the streets, the same manicured lawns stretched in neat precision, but something had shifted in the air. Silence still lingered, but it was no longer heavy with complicity. It was the silence of aftermath. A pause, after thunder, when the world waits to see what remains. Karen was gone from her porch. For years, her figure had stood there like a watchtower, eyes sharp, smile sharpened sharper. Now the chair where she sat during mornings with her coffee was empty, swaying slightly in the breeze. Neighbors glanced at it as they walked by, as though the absence itself demanded attention. The chair was not just a seat. It was a reminder of power once unchecked, of silence once weaponized, now left hollow. Marcus noticed it too. He walked past her house one evening, the light fading. Gold across the rooftops. The empty chair seemed smaller without her in it, fragile against the porch that had once magnified her presence. He felt no triumph in seeing it vacant. Instead, he felt the weight of how many voices had been swallowed before the silence finally broke. He thought of the neighbors who had spoken in the courtroom, their voices trembling as if learning to use them for the first time. He thought of the others who had stayed quiet, their silence not cruel but fearful, shaped by years of watching Karen's control. The chair was not just hers, it was theirs too, a warning of what happens when silence rules longer than truth. In HOA meetings after the trial, the difference was stark. Karen's place at the head table sat vacant. Papers were shuffled by other hands. Voices were less certain, less domineering. Without her, the board moved clumsily, as if learning how to walk again. Decisions were made slowly, carefully, some members fumbling over the rules they had once enforced without question. The absence echoed louder than any voice. For Marcus, the chair was a lesson. Power doesn't vanish when a person leaves. It lingers in the silence they shaped, in the habits people keep, even after the enforcer is gone. The fight wasn't finished just because one voice cracked. It was only beginning. That night, as he stood by his window, Marcus thought of how easily one person had bent silence into obedience, and how hard it had been to break it. The chair remained empty. But the question lingered. Would it stay that way? Or would someone else sit down, smile the same sharp smile, and pick up where she left off? The first thing Marcus did after the trial was return to his fence. It had stood through every notice, every accusation, every attempt to redefine it as flawed. Now, under the soft light of a spring morning, it gleamed with new meaning. He walked the line slowly, brush in hand, painting fresh, coats of white across the boards. Each stroke felt less like defense and more like reclamation. Neighbors watched again, but this time their gazes weren't sharpened with judgment. One by one, doors creaked open. A man across the street stepped, hesitated, then called out, "Need an extra brush?" Marcus looked up, startled, then nodded. "Always." The man crossed over, carrying a bucket of paint. Together they worked in silence at first, the kind that wasn't oppressive, but tentative. Silence trying to learn how to become voice. Soon, a woman from the next house brought cold water, setting it down without a word. Later, another neighbor came with a ladder to reach the higher planks. By afternoon, the fence that had once symbolized exclusion was being repainted by many hands. Karen's absence still hung in the air, but the community that remained seemed lighter without her grip. Marcus noticed how people began greeting one another in small ways. A nod at the mailbox, a wave at the curb. Conversations that had once cut off when he approached now lingered. The doors that had been closed to him began to open. One neighbor invited him for coffee, apologizing softly for their silence. "We were afraid," they admitted. "It was easier to stay quiet." Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he listened, letting the truth settle. Forgiveness didn't come easily, but acknowledgement was a beginning. As the fence dried, children rode their bikes along its edge, running their fingers across the smooth boards. To them, it wasn't a symbol of battle, but a bright line of safety. The fence had changed, not in form but in meaning. What Karen had turned into a barrier had become something shared. Inside his house, Marcus kept the folder of papers tucked neatly in a drawer. He no longer needed to spread them across his table like armor. He had proof, and he had victory, but what mattered more was the sound of neighbors speaking to him without hesitation. The silence that had once kept him cornered was breaking. Not all at once, not loudly, but in small ways. A greeting, a helping hand, a door that opened instead of shutting. For Marcus, the fence was no longer the story of where his property ended. It was the story of where the neighborhood began, again. History has a way of whispering through present walls, even when people pretend not to hear. As Marcus walked his street in the weeks after the trial, he felt echoes of older stories in every step. The notices, the silence, the attempts to erase him through procedure. They were new in form, but not in spirit. Generations before had faced rules designed to exclude, documents dressed in neutrality but sharpened into weapons. His fight was personal, but it was also part of something larger, something older. One evening, a teenager from down the block stopped him on the sidewalk. "My mom showed me the video," she said quietly. "The one from the meeting." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What did you think?" The girl hesitated, then answered, "I didn't know you could fight back like that." Her words stayed with him. This wasn't just about one eviction notice or one neighbor's arrogance. It was about what silence teaches, that some voices don't matter, that rules are unchangeable, that injustice is just the price of peace. By standing, Marcus had cracked that narrative open. The cracks spread further than his fence, further than his street. Articles circulated online. HOA harassment backfires, one headline read. Another called him the homeowner who owned back. Messages arrived from strangers in other states, stories of battles with boards, landlords, supervisors. People saw their struggles in his. His resistance had become more than defense. It had become representation. At the next community meeting, the atmosphere was transformed. Gone was the sharp edge of laughter and the suffocating silence. People spoke, haltingly at first, then with more certainty. A woman raised her hand to question a budget allocation, something she'd never dared before. A man challenged an unnecessary fee. Marcus noticed the ripple effect, voices multiplying, silence shrinking. But he also remembered the weight of silence that had nearly broken him. He knew it could return just as quickly if people forgot. That's why he saved. Every paper, every email, every recording, not out of bitterness but as a record. History erases too easily when there's no proof left behind. Standing by his fence one night, Marcus thought of the people who never had the chance to prove their truth, whose voices were buried under silence too thick to crack. He thought of his father, his grandfather, men who told stories of rules that bent against them, of voices swallowed before they could be heard. Now his fight stood beside theirs. His victory was not just about keeping his house. It was about carrying forward a voice they had been denied. The silence of the neighborhood had broken, but the silence of history still asked to be remembered. The neighborhood looked almost unchanged on the surface. The lawns still stretched in neat squares, the fences still gleamed white under the sun, and the mailboxes still stood in perfect rows. But Marcus knew the story wasn't in the perfection anymore. It was in the silence that followed. Silence. Once a weapon against him, now lived differently here. It wasn't fear. It wasn't complicity. It was choice. Karen's house remained, but her presence had faded like a shadow at dusk. Her chair still sat empty on the porch, weather slowly dulling its once polished arms. The chair was no longer a throne. It was a relic, and every time someone walked by, they looked at it and remembered. Marcus walked his yard one evening, the sky glowing in streaks of orange and purple. He traced his hand along the fence that had endured every accusation. Its boards, smooth and freshly painted, reflected the fading light. The fence had once symbolized division, then survival. Now it was something else entirely, a reminder that boundaries only hold meaning when people choose what they stand for. Neighbors greeted him openly now. Doors that had been closed without reason swung open, some with apologies, others with quiet offerings of trust. The same mouths that once stayed silent now practiced the weight of words. It was imperfect, halting, but real. Still, Marcus knew silence would always linger. He understood it wasn't gone. It had only shifted. Silence is never neutral. It is always a choice. And in the end, every person must decide whether to let it shield injustice or break it open with truth. He looked at the street, at the children biking along the sidewalks, at the neighbors tending their lawns, at the doors, now left open where they had once been bolted shut. The neighborhood would not forget Karen quickly, but they had been given a mirror, and in it, they had seen themselves. And then came the question, not for Marcus, not for Karen, not for one neighborhood, but for everyone watching, everyone listening, everyone scrolling through the story online. When silence becomes complicity, when rules are written against you, when belonging is made conditional, what will you do? Will you look away? Will you stay silent? Or will you speak? The story ended where it began, with fences, with doors, with silence. Except now, those symbols no longer belong to Karen. They belong to everyone who had watched, who had heard, who had seen what silence could do. The choice was no longer Marcus's alone. It was yours. So the question remains, when the rules are written against you, will you stay silent, or will you own the story? Drop your thoughts below.